The video game crash of 1983 was a defining moment in video game history and culture. Funnily enough, most gamers have never heard of this event. It's almost like it never happened. But it happened. It actually began in 1972. Atari was founded and co-founded by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney in Sunnyvale, California in 1972. Little did they know they would become the dominant leader of the entire market for almost 11 years. Immediately, they created the beloved game Pong, which took the arcades by storm and intruded personal homes in 1975, spawning a hit plug-and-play type system, launching Atari not only into the spotlight, but ahead of their competition. But these endeavors would pale in light of Atari's crowning achievement. The Atari Video Computer System 2600, also known as the Atari 2600, was Atari's most well-known console. Created in 1977, the console was a juggernaut in the second-generation consoles, beating out ColecoVision and Magnavox Odyssey 2 in almost every aspect. The 2600 was a large box made of wood and plastic. The controller was incredibly simple, only containing a single joystick and a single button, limiting video games greatly. The graphics were crude and unable to display detailed images, but that needn't matter. The games were still fun enough to keep people invested. It was the best alternative to an arcade machine in your house. But all great things must fall eventually, and the Atari 2600's faults were soon to become obvious. 5 years after the Atari 2600's release in 1982, and 10 years after the founding of Atari, news started to spread that the company was having a few problems with management and earnings. Warner Communications Inc., a technology company that had purchased Atari, revealed that there was to be an unexpected decline in annual earnings for that quarter of the year. Not only that, but in a short period of 2 weeks during December of 1982, 3 executives were fired from Atari. During coverage of the incident by New York Times, Atari was described as not prepared for the sudden loss of profit as the company was loosely held together and the management had little experience.
They're treating their employees that badly. It can't be treating the people who are creating their games or trying to sell them much better.
At around the same time this began to occur, Commodore, a computer company, released their hit product, the Commodore 64. While it was released in January of that year, it would prove to become troublesome by the time December arrived, as not only could the computer do math, taxes, run educational programs alongside playing games, its prices would inevitably drop during the Christmas season. The Commodore 64 would become not only the ultimate challenger to consoles, but proved to be too much for Atari to bear. By the time 1983 came around, the market for video games was oversaturated. With the exception of a few highlights, the Atari 2600 didn't seem to have any must-have games. But what it did have was called shovelware, non-inspired, cliché games that often served nothing more than to be advertisements. This was taking its toll on the main demographic they were looking for: children. In an interview with 12-year-old Chris Foodie, he stated, "A while back, a lot of games like Pac-Man I used to like a lot. Now these games are really boring. They're all the same. You kill the invaders and that's it. Boring." Children were no longer invested, and they weren't marketing to the adults, some of which were campaigning hard against the negative impact that they thought games had on their children's minds. It also didn't help that Atari and other video game companies were fighting a furious price war with each other to help boost sales and remove competition from new competitors. While not many new competitors could survive long enough to pose a threat, Commodore was still a major thorn in the video game industry. Yet, computer companies like Texas Instruments and Apple were seeing cut profits as well. Even with the introduction of new Laserdisc technology into arcade machines, the video game scene was fizzled out by Christmas of 1983. It was just a silly fad from the 70s. Or was it? Two years later, by 1985, the market for video games in the United States was destroyed. Computers were used for work, and children opted to play outside or play old video games. In Japan, however, the video game market was thriving. A historical playing card company by the name of Nintendo was currently controlling a large portion of the market with their family computer, known as the Famicom. Nintendo, seeing a power vacuum, made a very important decision. They were not only going to resurrect the American video game market, but they were going to dominate it. Their first target was New York City. If they can make it there, they can make it anywhere. First, they renamed the system from the Famicom to the NES, also known as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Instead of marketing it as a video game console, they marketed it as a toy. This was an entertainment system that inserted game packs into a loading deck, not some silly consoles with cartridges. They even created a small robot toy named Rob to be sold with the console. At first, the system only sold a few thousand consoles in the first few months, and stores were not willing to take the device. But Nintendo of America struck a deal. They would provide the consoles, but the stores only had to buy what they sold. It was a huge risk, but it worked. The system sold, and it sold well. Since the NES had technically been out for 2 years, it already had lots of games. Among these were Ice Climbers, Excite Bike, and Duck Hunt, all of which were well received.
First of all, they actually had good design for their products. Then they produced them both inexpensively and with good quality. And finally, they had a really good marketing team.
But none could match Nintendo's Juggernaut, which released later that year. Games during this time had to be good. They were reviving a dead market. Super Mario Bros. Practically reinvented the platformer genre. Legends of Zelda and Metroid had expansive worlds to explore, which is very impressive compared to what little Atari 2600 could do. The NES controller had 3 extra buttons, which were used to equip items, jump, shoot, open doors, and pause the game, which gave more freedom to developers to create new and interesting gameplay mechanics. In The Legend of Zelda, you could have a side weapon or item that could be used for different situations. Metroid, when pressing the select button, could let your main character equip missiles, which could be used to open doors. All of this would not have been possible with the single button controller that the Atari provided. Through the later years of the NES, more classics such as Final Fantasy, Mega Man, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, and Star Tropics came into fruition. Tetris, an obscure game from the distant Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was released onto the NES, as well as the Game Boy, a small handheld device that played simple games. Released in 1989, this small device invented the handheld gaming industry with games such as the Super Mario Land series, Metroid 2, and its pack-in title, Tetris. By the time the NES was discontinued in 2003, the video game market in the United States is one of the largest markets in the industry, alongside Japan, South Korea, and Europe. With recent interested video games from the 80s and 90s, emulators, computer programs that play older games from the 70s to early 2000s, began to appear. Because of the surge of interest, I felt this topic needed to be shared. Like I said before, this moment in history might as well not have happened, as it was very poorly documented. But the video games we have today are defined by the catastrophe in 1983, and we owe all our games to Nintendo.